Hey everybody, Rachel here. We're talking about the testing that Young Living does on their essential oils, and I'm going to try and blast through a couple of them here today and not get into the weeds. But one of the major things that they use is organoleptic testing. And I'm sure you're like me, you're like, say, what is organoleptic testing? That's a real word. And it basically means that they're using an organ, this organ right here. They have trained people on staff. I want you to think about like a wine sommelier, right? Like they can detect these notes in the wine that are like far beyond anything that we can comprehend. But they may say, oh, it's got a very woodsy, balsamic aroma, and we'll taste the wine and be like, actually, yes, it does. But I couldn't pick that out, right? These people are specially trained, and the sommelier test is like unbelievably impossible to pass. It's kind of like an opera singer who's training, and if you tell them to hit the key of A, they can just like, whoa, and I don't know what key I just did, but it was probably not A, and it wasn't very good. But they can just hit these certain notes because they have trained their voice. It's the same thing with training your nose. There are people who have studied for decades, and they can identify like the nuances of an oil. But here's the thing why, again, Young Living really shines is because they have these organoleptic tests that people can do, and they can just basically sniff an oil and immediately discern that something's off, or there's too much of this constituent or too much of that. And so they may not be able to identify precisely what that thing is, but they know that something's not quite right. Sometimes they can identify what it is. I was actually just watching a webinar by an aromatherapy woman, and she was talking about before she got her aromatherapy certificate, she had opened up a little shop where she was selling essential oils, and a specialist from Europe actually came over and was kind of going through her shop and smelling the different oils, and they got to the bottle of sweet marjoram. And now this vendor, of course, had bought her sweet marjoram from some third-party vendor who had said it was in fact sweet marjoram, so she bottled it, or labeled it and was selling it as such. Well, this European specialist, this organoleptic specialist, smelled this sweet marjoram and was like, this is not sweet marjoram, this is Spanish sage. And they sent it off to a third-party laboratory, and lo and behold, that person was correct. Their nose was correct. She was able to discern higher camphor levels in the oil that the average palate wouldn't be able to discern. She was trained with her specialty to be able to discern that, and she was right, okay? So organoleptic testing is not to be like mocked or laughed at or disregarded in any way, shape, or form, because I couldn't do it. It takes an intense amount of training. But here's the thing about Young Living that is so great. You can have people who do this organoleptic testing for these different companies, and there's other big companies out there that I won't name. However, where are they getting all their oils from? They're getting them from third-party vendors. They're getting them from a farm over here and a farm over there and a farm over there, and who knows where. But the point is that a person who's doing the sniff testing is not going to be able to, with any real discernment, tell, because the lavender that comes from here and comes from there and comes from there, and all these different farms and all these different third-party vendors, they're all totally different growing conditions, totally different climate, totally different soil. They're going to have different constituents in it. They are not going to smell the same one to another, right? Versus Young Living, where they're growing all of their lavender in-house, and so an organoleptologist would be able to identify and know and be very familiar with the lavender that Young Living is producing and the other oils that they actually are growing in-house. So it's really only truly, truly valuable to a certain level when you are controlling the plants that are being grown. You're controlling the growing circumstances. You're controlling the environment there. And that is where your organoleptologist, that's a mouthful, can really come in and discern if there's anything that's not quite right. They can discern that like during the distillation process and be like, wait a second, this isn't quite ready. Maybe the lavender has been cut, but it's not ready to go into the cooker yet. It needs to sit on that asphalt for a little while and just kind of like let those constituents come out a little bit more. They can discern that because they're so intimately familiar with the Young Living plants themselves. Okay, so again, wanting a company that is heavily detail involved in the growth and harvest and distillation of their own plants, which is where Young Living really shines. So organoleptic testing is like a huge, big deal. But there's a couple of others out there that I just want to touch on. One of them, another one is called infrared spectroscopy. I can't say it. I can't say it, but here's what it looks like. All that really means is, and this is not how they do the test, it's a very simplified version of it, but they basically take infrared light and they shoot it in to these mirrors, and they shoot it into the essential oil and then back out again, and then they measure how much of that infrared light has actually been absorbed into this substance, okay? And they shoot different wavelengths of light. So they'll do one and they'll measure it, they'll shoot another light and they'll measure it, and so on and so forth, okay? And so and every oil will have its own fingerprint. So when you shoot these different wavelengths of light through the oil and then you measure how much actually comes out the other end, each oil has a different fingerprint, so they can measure those oils. And again, and they have a fingerprint, right? Just like we have a fingerprint. So if there's any adulterants or anything that's off with the oil, that fingerprint will be different. So they can like literally, just like they do in the police crime reports, they can measure the fingerprint side by side and say, something wasn't right with this batch. Okay, there's this one, the Optical Emission Spectrometry. Okay, this is kind of cool. They'll take the oil or the constituent and they will heat it. And of course, as these molecules get excited, they will emit, there's a certain light emission that they will emit right here. And it's kind of like a prism, right? You know how when we would shine a beam of white light into a prism, it would separate it? That's kind of what's happening here. So you've got these different wavelengths of light that are being produced from the oil constituent, and then they measure the emission wavelengths. And again, this is a fingerprint of an oil, so they know if something is off about an oil. And in case you're not sure what a wavelength is, one might have a wavelength like this and one might like this, and the wavelength is from the top crescent, the crest of the wave to the next crest of the wave. So this is a longer wavelength than this one, guys, taking you back to high school chemistry there. Okay, so it's kind of cool. And you know that when you heat something, it excites the molecules and then they start to emit this light. They measure the light. That's the fingerprint of the oil. So again, they match the fingerprint and they say, okay, this looks good, or we don't have a match here. We gotta take another look at this oil. There's refractometry. Did I say that right? Yes, I'm reading it backwards, guys. Okay. Now, this is not a diagram of what the test looks like, but you've all seen this test like in elementary school science where you like put a pencil into a cup of water and it looks like it bends. Okay, that's because the light waves are coming in, they hit the water and they change, they move slower, or they move at a different speed, okay? So they will essentially take an essential oil and shoot light through it, and then they will measure the speed at which that light travels through the oil. Again, the fingerprint of the oil, it's going to travel through frankincense, different than it's going to travel through chamomile, different than it's going to travel through lavender. And then they will measure those fingerprints and make sure that, because if there's any adulterants in there, any kind of chemical solvent or anything like that, they're going to get a different fingerprint. We're not going to have a match. So specific gravity. Also, you guys should be familiar with this. We would test for buoyancy. You're really looking at density, right? We know that an essential oil should be less dense than water, so it really should float up on the top, right, like this. So of course they will have to immerse them in different liquids so that they can test the density of the different oils. But again, the density of an oil in its pure form will have a fingerprint, so they can test these oils against these different liquids and test their density. And if an oil has extra water in it, or if it has alcohols or solvents or something, it's going to have a different density. It may like sink to the bottom when it's not supposed to. And so again, another little fingerprint of oil. So they have many, many different ways of looking at these oils and knowing beyond the shadow of a doubt if the fingerprints match up, that your oils are pure. They don't necessarily run all of these tests, but they do run very, very many of them. I have a couple others that I'm going to share with you tomorrow and then wrap it all up. I hope this has been somewhat interesting for you. I think it's super fascinating to know the lengths that they go to make sure that we are getting the highest quality, purest therapeutic grade oils on planet Earth. Super awesome.